Imagine a spice so valuable in the Middle Ages that it was guarded by laws, fought over in wars, and measured out like treasure. This spice wasn't pepper, cinnamon, or gold itself, it was saffron. From fragile purple crocus flowers came threads that colored feasts, healed sickness, and even carried symbolic meaning in churches and manuscripts. Tonight, we'll step into the forgotten world where saffron shaped diets, trade routes, and power in medieval Europe. By the end, you'll understand why people once treated this little flower as if it were gold itself. Chapter 1. Fields of Color, where saffron came from. When you think about medieval Europe, your mind probably drifts toward castles, knights in armor, or the bustle of a marketplace filled with cloth, pottery, and grain. But among all of these ordinary sights, one thing stood apart: a small, delicate thread plucked from the flower of the Crocus sativus. This thread, deep red with hints of orange, was saffron. Today, saffron remains the world's most expensive spice, and its reputation for being worth its weight in gold has lingered for centuries. But in the Middle Ages, saffron was more than just a luxury. It was a symbol of status, a medicine, a dye, and even a part of survival for kings, nobles, and merchants who tied their fortunes to its trade. To understand why medieval Europe treated saffron as it did, we need to look closely not only at what saffron was, but how it was produced, why it mattered, and who had access to it, the plant and its fragile harvest. The saffron crocus was not native to most of Europe. It came from regions stretching across Persia, parts of the Levant, and into Mediterranean climates where winters were mild and summers not too dry. Unlike hardy crops such as rye, oats, or barley, saffron could not simply be scattered in a field and left to grow. Each flower had to be carefully cultivated. More importantly, each blossom produced only 3 fragile stigmas. The saffron threads themselves, they had to be picked by hand, one by one, at exactly the right time of day. If you imagine the work involved, it becomes easier to see why saffron commanded such value. To gather even 1 pound of saffron threads required the harvest of approximately 70,000 flowers. The workers, often peasants or laborers, would bend over the fields, picking blossoms by hand at dawn, when the petals were fresh and had not yet wilted. From there, the stigmas were separated, dried carefully to preserve their potency, and stored away from light or dampness. This was not the kind of crop you could entrust to casual effort. Entire harvests could be ruined by a sudden frost, unexpected rain, or mishandling. Unlike grain or wool, saffron could not be easily replaced in poor conditions. It was both fragile and rare, making its survival and availability directly tied to labor, skill, and luck. Saffron's arrival in Europe. Saffron's earliest journey into Europe came by way of trade routes that connected the Islamic world with the Mediterranean. Arab merchants introduced saffron into Spain during the early Middle Ages, and from there it spread into southern France and Italy. The climate in these regions was more favorable to its growth than the harsher conditions of northern Europe. But saffron was not just a local crop. Much of Europe's supply continued to come from long-distance trade routes stretching back to Persia and beyond. The movement of saffron along these routes meant that its price reflected not only the difficulty of its harvest but also the hazards of transport. Ships carrying saffron could be attacked by pirates. Caravans bearing saffron across deserts and mountains risked being plundered. Each risk added to the cost, making saffron all the more precious by the time it reached a European market. The price of threads. By the late medieval period, saffron had become so expensive that it was literally compared to precious metals. In some cases, a single ounce of saffron could cost the equivalent of several days' wages for a skilled craftsman. In larger towns and cities, saffron was kept in tightly guarded chests by apothecaries and spice merchants, who sold it in small measured amounts. It wasn't just a food ingredient. Wealthy households displayed saffron as part of their kitchens, much like modern homes might display fine wines or exotic artwork. To serve food flavored or colored with saffron was to demonstrate both wealth and refinement. Nobles and kings understood that saffron carried a symbolism that went beyond its flavor. It was a sign of power and access. A multi-purpose treasure, saffron's role in medieval Europe extended well beyond the dinner table. As medicine, apothecaries prized saffron for its supposed healing properties. It was believed to strengthen the heart, cure melancholy, and even act as an aphrodisiac. In an age when medicine was often a mix of herbs, minerals, and theory, saffron's bright color and rarity seemed to confirm its special powers. Physicians prescribed it in tonics, powders, and infusions for ailments ranging from coughs to digestive troubles. As dye, saffron also held value as a dye, particularly for cloths used in religious settings. Its bright golden hue was associated with holiness, wealth, and divine light. Monastic orders sometimes used saffron to color garments or manuscripts, linking the spice directly with spirituality and display. As flavoring and preservative in cooking, saffron was used not only for its distinct taste, but also for its ability to mask unpleasant flavors in foods that were less fresh. In large banquets, saffron-colored dishes stood out on the table as symbols of luxury, turning ordinary rice or meat into golden delicacies. Saffron's place in medieval society. To truly appreciate saffron's importance, you must imagine the world of medieval Europe, where food was usually plain, repetitive, and limited by the seasons. Most people lived on bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables or salted meats they could obtain. Against this backdrop, saffron was a burst of color and taste. A nobleman might present saffron-infused dishes at a feast, not because they were filling or nutritious, but because they displayed wealth and sophistication to guests. The same dish, when placed before peasants or laborers, would have seemed almost unimaginable, an extravagance far outside their means. And so saffron became part of the visual and cultural divide between the wealthy and the poor. It was not a food for survival, but a symbol of privilege. Risks and temptations of counterfeiting. Whenever an item becomes so valuable, the temptation to cheat grows with it. Medieval Europe saw frequent problems with saffron adulteration. Unscrupulous traders mixed in cheaper substances, such as dried marigold petals or colored grasses, to bulk up their saffron stock. Some merchants even dyed threads with honey and oxblood to mimic saffron's vibrant red. Authorities took this fraud very seriously. In certain cities, harsh punishments awaited those caught selling fake saffron. In Nuremberg, for example, the so-called saffron law of the 15th century made it a capital crime to adulterate saffron. Convicted offenders could face execution, demonstrating just how vital authenticity was to trade and trust saffron in times of crisis. Perhaps nothing highlights saffron's importance more than the Saffron War of the 14th century. During the Black Death, saffron was believed to have medicinal properties that could ward off or cure the plague. This belief drove demand to extraordinary heights. A shipment of saffron bound for Basel was seized by nobles, sparking a conflict over who controlled this precious cargo. For 14 weeks, rival factions fought over the spice. Although the event was localized, it revealed how deeply Europe valued saffron, not just as a luxury, but as a commodity worth going to war over. A spice of paradox. In many ways, saffron was both ordinary and extraordinary. At its core, it was a simple plant grown in fields, picked by laborers, and transported by merchants. But in the minds of medieval Europeans, it became something more. It was a promise of health, a sign of status, and a symbol of wealth condensed into fragile red threads. And yet, with every flower yielding only 3 small threads, saffron's supply was always tenuous. Each year's harvest was a gamble against the elements and the risks of trade. For every noble who feasted on saffron dishes, there were countless others who could only dream of its golden glow. So, what does it say about a society when a spice could hold such power, commanding not only markets but wars and laws? Chapter 2. The Roads of Gold, Trade. Merchants and Saffron's journey across Europe. If you close your eyes and imagine medieval Europe's trade routes, you may picture long caravans winding across dusty roads or merchant ships with sails, full of wind drifting across the Mediterranean. These images are not far from reality. But when it came to saffron, the delicate red threads required something more than just transport. They demanded protection, trust, and the willingness to gamble with fortune. By the late Middle Ages, saffron had become so desirable that it stood at the center of Europe's expanding trade networks. Unlike grain, which could be grown in many places, or wool, which was tied to specific regions, saffron was both rare and portable. It was valuable in small amounts, easy to hide and easy to lose. Its journey from field to noble table tells us much about how medieval society valued goods. Enforced trust and measured wealth, the spice routes into Europe. Saffron's earliest path into Europe traced the same lines that carried pepper, cinnamon, and silk. From Persia, it traveled westward through Anatolia and across the Mediterranean. Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus, became a major hub for saffron cultivation in the early medieval period, thanks to both its climate and its connection to Islamic agricultural knowledge. From Spain, saffron spread north into France and Italy, entering markets through ports like Marseille, Venice, and Genoa. The Venetian Republic, in particular, played a crucial role. Its merchants dominated Mediterranean spice trade by the 13th and 14th centuries. Saffron, though not as bulky as pepper or ginger, held a prestige that made it one of Venice's prized commodities. Ships returning from the Levant carried small but highly profitable amounts of saffron, which were then auctioned in Venetian markets before being distributed across the continent, overland. Saffron also entered through trade routes stretching into southern Germany and Switzerland. Caravans carried it through the Alps, often guarded to prevent theft. Unlike bulky goods like timber or grain, saffron could be packed into small wooden boxes, each wrapped carefully to preserve the threads from moisture. The merchants who dealt in saffron in the marketplaces of medieval Europe. Saffron belonged to the world of spice merchants, apothecaries, and cloth dyers. These were not ordinary peddlers selling onions or bread. Spice merchants were wealthy, powerful, and sometimes mistrusted figures who controlled commodities that most people could scarcely imagine. A spice merchant's shop might hold sacks of pepper, ginger roots, cinnamon sticks, and a tiny, tightly guarded box of saffron threads. The spice was weighed on delicate scales with brass weights to ensure accuracy. Even the smallest mismeasurement could cost a merchant dearly, since saffron's value was measured by the ounce or less. Some merchants specialized so much in saffron that their reputations were tied to it. A successful saffron dealer could become wealthy enough to fund civic projects or gain favor with rulers. In Basel, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg, merchant families built fortunes in part through saffron trade. Their names recorded in city accounts as benefactors and power brokers, but wealth brought suspicion. Because saffron was so valuable, accusations of fraud were common. Was the saffron pure? Had it been adulterated with marigold or safflower petals? Could a merchant be trusted, or was he cheating his customers? To protect both consumers and merchants, cities introduced strict regulations. In Frankfurt, for instance, saffron imports were carefully inspected, and fraudulent dealers faced heavy fines or worse. The Saffron War, a conflict over spice. No story of saffron's trade can be told without mentioning the Saffron War of 1347. Europe was in the grip of the Black Death, and saffron's reputation as a medicine had pushed demand to extreme levels. A shipment of saffron valued at thousands of gold coins was en route to Basel when it was seized by noblemen from a rival territory. The theft did not end quietly. Instead, it sparked a 14-week conflict between factions who sought control of the spice. Skirmishes, raids, and negotiations followed, with saffron at the heart of the struggle. Though the war itself was small compared to larger medieval conflicts, it revealed saffron's importance. Here was a product so valuable that men were willing to kill for it. Armies were raised over it, and cities risked their reputations to secure it. The Saffron War left a legacy of heightened regulation and control over saffron shipments. Merchants became more cautious, cities more protective, and customers more suspicious. But trade in the spice continued, because the demand did not disappear. The economics of a delicate thread, saffron's trade rested on a paradox. It was both fragile and powerful. A small wooden chest of saffron, no larger than a modern loaf of bread, could represent more wealth than an entire cart of grain. This portability made it attractive for merchants, but dangerous for transport. Thieves and pirates targeted saffron shipments precisely because of this concentration of value. Records from the Hanseatic League, a powerful trading alliance in Northern Europe, show how merchants treated saffron with extraordinary care. When saffron shipments arrived in cities like Lübeck or Hamburg, they were cataloged in detail, taxed at higher rates, and sometimes locked in city warehouses until sold. Pricing fluctuated depending on harvests, wars, and plagues. A poor harvest in Spain or Italy could double the price in Northern Europe. Likewise, a successful trade convoy arriving in Venice could suddenly flood the market and reduce costs. Merchants speculated, hoarded, and sometimes manipulated supply to maintain high prices. In many ways, saffron behaved like a financial commodity. As much as a spice, the labor behind the trade. For all the glittering wealth associated with saffron, it is important to remember the unseen laborers who made it possible. In Spain, southern France, and parts of Italy, peasants worked the saffron fields. They bent over rows of crocus flowers, picking each blossom by hand. The harvest season was brief, lasting only a few weeks in autumn, but the work was intense. Families often worked together, including women and children. To maximize yield, after picking, the stigmas were carefully separated from the petals and dried over low heat or in the sun. Too much heat, and the saffron lost its potency. Too little, and it spoiled. Skill mattered, and peasants who harvested saffron passed down their methods through generations. And yet, these laborers rarely shared in the wealth of the spice. They were paid modestly, while merchants and nobles reaped the profits. In this sense, saffron mirrored the broader inequalities of medieval society, a product of collective labor transformed into a symbol of elite privilege. The role of guilds and laws by the 15th century. Saffron had inspired an entire system of oversight. In cities like Nuremberg, saffron quality was inspected by guild-appointed officials. Any sign of adulteration, whether by mixing in cheaper flowers, staining threads, or misweighing portions, was met with harsh punishment. The Saffron Law of 1444 in Nuremberg is a striking example. It declared that anyone caught tampering with saffron could face execution by fire. The extremity of this law shows not only the spice's economic importance, but also the fear of undermining trust in the market. If customers lost faith in saffron, its value would collapse. Other cities were less extreme, but still strict. In Basel, saffron had to be stored in official warehouses under city control. In Venice, merchants were required to declare their shipments openly to avoid smuggling. Such measures reveal how saffron was treated almost like currency too valuable to be left unregulated. The silent travelers, smuggling and hidden trade. Of course, wherever rules exist, so do attempts to bypass them. Saffron smuggling was common, with traders hiding threads in barrels of wool, sacks of grain, or even inside clothing. Women were sometimes used as couriers, carrying small amounts hidden in hems or undergarments, as they were less likely to be searched. These illicit trades kept saffron moving, even when wars or blockades disrupted normal routes. Smugglers risked not only fines but sometimes their lives if caught, since cities viewed illegal saffron trade as theft from the common good. A spice that moved the world, in tracing saffron's path from field to market. You begin to see how deeply it was woven into the medieval economy. It shaped trade routes, enriched merchant families, and created entire systems of regulation. But saffron also carried with it risk, corruption, and inequality. To the nobleman at a feast, saffron was golden rice, gilded sauces, or bright pastries. To the apothecary, it was medicine measured in tiny doses. To the peasant, it was exhausting autumn labor in the fields with little reward. And to the merchant, it was a gamble that could bring fortune or ruin depending on the winds, the harvest, and the honesty of others. So why did saffron matter so much? Was it only the taste and the color? Or was it something more? Its very rarity, its fragility, its ability to symbolize power in a way that bread or wool never could. Chapter 3. Saffron's place at the medieval table, medicine, ritual, and memory. When you imagine a medieval banquet, you probably picture long wooden tables, flickering candlelight, and platters of roasted meats. But if you look closer at the golden-tinted rice, the shining sauces, or the pastries with a faint orange glow, you may notice saffron. Its presence was subtle but powerful, marking dishes as luxurious, festive, and far beyond the reach of ordinary diets. In this final section, we turn from the roads of saffron trade to its place in daily life. Medicine, art, and memory. The noble table and the golden dish at noble feasts. Saffron was more than a flavor, it was a display of wealth. Recipes preserved in medieval cookbooks, such as the Form of Cury, compiled by the cooks of Richard II of England in the late 14th century, regularly call for saffron. It colored sauces, enriched broths, and gave roasted meats an exotic shine. Imagine sitting at a feast in a baron's hall in England. Before you is a dish of golden rice, cooked with saffron, its brilliant hue contrasting with the dark wood of the table. Platters of pottage, thick soups of vegetables and grains gleam faintly from the spice. Even custards and sweet pastries are tinged with saffron, offering a taste both earthy and floral to the guests. The message is clear. This lord can afford saffron, and by extension, his wealth and connections stretch far beyond the borders of his estate. Just as today we might measure status by luxury cars or jewelry, in the Middle Ages saffron in food was a clear sign of privilege. Saffron and the common diet. For peasants, saffron was nearly invisible. Their diets consisted mostly of bread, porridge, peas, beans, and occasional bits of meat. The fields where saffron crocus might have grown were usually controlled by landlords, and the harvest passed directly into the hands of merchants. At most, peasants might see saffron appear in small doses during religious festivals, when church feasts sometimes included dishes flavored with it. But for most of Europe's population, saffron was known more as a rumor than a reality. They may have smelled it in passing at markets or heard of its medical powers, but few tasted it. This gap between noble and common diets reinforced saffron's symbolic role as a food of hierarchy. Saffron in medicine. Saffron was not just for the table, it was also part of the apothecary's shelf. Medieval medicine leaned heavily on humoral theory, which balanced the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Saffron was considered warming and drying, qualities that made it useful for treating conditions linked to cold and damp humors. Medical texts recommended saffron as a treatment for melancholy, heart weakness, indigestion, and even plague symptoms. It was said to lift the spirit, brighten the complexion, and soothe pain. Apothecaries would grind saffron into powders, mix it with honey, or steep it into infusions. However, medieval doctors also warned of dangers. Too much saffron, they believed, could cause overstimulation, dizziness, or even death. The spice's potency, whether real or imagined, gave it a dual reputation: healer in small doses, poison in excess. This made saffron not only expensive but powerful, a reminder that even the most desirable substances carried risks. The spiritual and symbolic role of saffron. beyond kitchens and apothecaries. Saffron held symbolic meaning in religion and art. In medieval Christian thought, golden colors often symbolized purity, divinity, and sacred light. While saffron itself was not a religious sacrament, it sometimes colored liturgical garments, ceremonial foods, or festive church meals. In illuminated manuscripts, golden ink sometimes included saffron-based pigments. Artists prized the dye for its bright hue, using it in illustrations of saints' robes, heavenly light, or rich borders. Though less permanent than gold leaf, saffron's brilliance carried symbolic weight. Some monasteries also cultivated saffron as part of their gardens, valuing it both for medicinal use and for coloring foods during feast days. Thus, saffron linked the sacred and the mundane. It touched the altar, the infirmary, and the dining hall. Festivals and celebrations. The presence of saffron was most visible during festivals. In wealthy towns, civic feasts might serve saffron-infused dishes to mark a special occasion, such as the visit of a king or the dedication of a church. Guilds sometimes used saffron in their communal meals to display their prosperity. In Nuremberg, famous for its saffron markets, guild records describe the use of saffron in large ceremonial banquets. Here, saffron was more than spice, it was civic pride made edible. Proof that the city's trade connections brought the best of the world to its tables. The decline and survival of saffron's prestige. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the explosion of global trade began to overshadow saffron. New spices like nutmeg, cloves, and chili peppers arrived from Asia and the Americas, capturing European tastes and diversifying kitchens. Saffron remained valuable but no longer stood alone as the ultimate luxury. Still, it survived in particular regional cuisines. Spain's famous paella became one of saffron's lasting culinary legacies, linking medieval trade to modern identity. In parts of France, Italy, and Germany, saffron continued to appear in both sweet and savory dishes, especially in traditional holiday cooking. Medicinally, saffron lost much of its central place as humoral medicine faded and new scientific methods took hold. Yet even today, saffron is valued in herbal remedies for mood and digestion, echoing its medieval role. A legacy of gold. If we step back, what does saffron's medieval story reveal? It shows how a fragile flower could shape trade routes, laws, and wars. It highlights the contrast between the lives of peasants who harvested it and nobles who consumed it. It reminds us how societies attach meaning to objects not only for their practical uses, but for their symbolism. Saffron was never just food. It was medicine, status, wealth, and trust all woven into one delicate thread. To call it worth its weight in gold was not simply metaphor. It reflected a lived reality in which saffron influenced economies, inspired laws, and decorated both feasts and holy books today. When you see saffron strands steeping in a pot of rice or brightening a festive dish, you are witnessing a continuity that stretches back hundreds of years. The golden spice remains a bridge between the medieval table and the modern kitchen. But the final question lingers: if saffron's worth in the Middle Ages rested so much on rarity, fragility, and prestige, does its modern survival reflect the same values? Or has saffron become something else entirely? A fragment of history preserved in taste and memory rather than wealth and power? And that brings us to the end of tonight's quiet journey through history. I hope these stories helped slow down your thoughts and ease you into rest. If you enjoyed this calm corner of the past, I'd be grateful if you gave this video a like and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. It helps me keep bringing you these long, gentle stories to drift off to. Thank you for listening, and may your night be peaceful and your sleep deep.